Hey, folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk about the Beatles exclusively here on this show. We have a special guest with us who's been a guest several times, and I'm always happy to welcome him back. It's Kris Engelhardt, and he's the author of The Beatles Fully Uncovered. When it comes to side projects of the Beatles, Kris is the top expert in that field. He's put out several books on this subject, and this one that just came out really covers everything, all compiled together. Side projects is a fascinating side of the Beatles' history and in their music. We're talking about songs that they either wrote or co-wrote for another artist, or songs where they perform for the artists, playing a variety of instruments, maybe one, maybe several. And then there's also producing for other artists. And Kris, well, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio. Always great to have you here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
I think what we should do here, what I propose to Kris is that there's so much stuff that's been done in this category. It's always fun to compile your own list of what you feel are the best or your favorites in each of those categories. We're only going to lightly touch upon the production aspect, but I thought we'd talk heavily about songs that they wrote for other people and songs that they perform on for other people. And so, why don't we start with you, Kris? And I tell you, when I first proposed this idea, I was thinking top five. It's almost impossible for me to narrow everything down to five because there's so much music that's out there. A lot of it I would consider classic status. And then there's a lot of songs that many people don't even know about. But why not give us a top five of yours, or if you want to add more to the list, that's fine, of songs that the Beatles wrote for other people or co-wrote.
Well, needless to say, early on in the Beatles' career and in John Lennon and Paul McCartney's songwriting career, they very much wanted to be recognized as songwriters. And so they were anxious to push, let's say, maybe songs that they didn't feel were necessarily suited for the Beatles sound, or they wanted to help artists that were friends of theirs from Liverpool that were also happened to be managed by Brian Epstein and NEMS. So this was a matter of them, on the one hand, helping friends and helping their management team, and on the other hand, being able to get their songs out there that they might not necessarily otherwise have recorded within the confines of the Beatles. And the people that come to mind right off the top are Cilla Black and Billy J.Kramer. And so early on, mostly it was mostly Paul that wrote the bulk of the songs that the Beatles gave away while the Beatles were still the Beatles. Following their breakup, John did a lot. Most of his composition contributions were to Yoko Ono or the few other bands that he worked with, or people like David Bowie or uh, Elephant's Memory.
Hmm.
But Paul was always anxious to work with people like Peter and Gordon because Peter Asher was the brother of his then girlfriend and later fiance, Jane Asher. So Paul was anxious to help Peter and Gordon and gave them, I believe, four songs in total.
Right.
We had Woman, which I think would have been a great Beatles song.
Hmm.
And there are several versions of that song. Paul was never happy, nor were Peter and Gordon, with the released version of that song. And then there was Nobody I Know, I Don't Want to See You Again, and World Without Love, all of which were hits. McCartney released Woman, which was his final contribution to Peter and Gordon, under an assumed name because he was growing weary of the criticism that any artist that released a Lennon and McCartney song with their name on it would automatically be guaranteed to be a hit because of the name recognition of the two famous composers. So McCartney issued the song under the pseudonym Bernard Webb, but folks soon caught on because it was under Northern Songs and Macklin Music, the publisher, and so that raised eyebrows. And of course, the song is very McCartney-esque.
Hmm.
So it was soon discovered, and Paul had to admit that, as did Peter and Gordon, that yes, indeed, Paul had written Woman. But the other songs, were solid songs, and really everything they gave away to Billy J.Kramer, for example, "I'll Keep You Satisfied" again would have been a great Beatles song in my opinion,
I agree. Yeah.
and "Bad to Me," which John wrote, would have been a great Beatles song. "From a Window" was another one, and then "I Call Your Name," even though we consider those Beatles songs, uh, they were actually released. That song was released prior to the Beatles' release of that song, so it certainly qualifies as a composition contribution to another artist. So, and "I Call
Right.
Your Name's" a great song, and of course, the Mamas and the Papas years later did a great version of that song as well. So, I think it was important to Paul and John early on that they not only established themselves within the Beatles as songwriters, but as songwriters at large. I think they envisioned themselves as kind of a Bacharach David, or
Carole
other
King.
songwriting, yeah, Carole King, or other songwriting
Hmm.
teams that were out there, uh, who were famous. Everybody wanted to get one of their songs
Hmm.
exclusively and record it. So, but as time went on, less and less songs were given away to other artists. Once Brian Epstein had died and the Beatles formed Apple, that provided a whole new opportunity for the Beatles to start to work with these artists that they'd signed to their own label, such as Jackie Lomax and Doris
Hmm.
Troy and Badfinger and James Taylor. So it was kind of a blessing in disguise that Apple came along, because after about 1965, between 65 and 68, the Beatles didn't really contribute much to any other artists' recordings, either as players or as composers. But when Apple was born, that provided a real outlet for their talents. Each Beatle was sort of assigned an artist that had been signed to the label, George being Doris Troy and Jackie Lomax, Paul being initially Badfinger and Mary Hopkin, and John was pretty much, his time was taken up with Yoko Ono's projects. So John didn't do too much for other artists other than Elephant's Memory for Apple. And Ringo at that time really didn't do much at all. He had a little bit of work with John Tavner, one of his albums, through kind of a coincidence that even came about. But as a result of Apple, they really got busy again. George worked with Ronnie Spector, and so there were
Doris
all kinds of
Troy.
Doris Troy. Yeah, there were all
Yeah.
kinds of opportunities. Paul worked with James Taylor. They gave a song to Mortimer,
Hmm.
originally titled "On Our Way Home," which became "Two of Us," which ended up on the Let It Be album. And they were auditioning songs for Joe Cocker, who they admired, and were going to give him. Joe wanted something, and wisely, George resisted that request, and he also wanted "She Came In Through the Bathroom Window," which he ended up doing,
Hmm.
and they loved his version "With a Little Help from My Friends."
Right.
So, and Paul at one point had gone ahead and given Aretha Franklin "Let It Be," and ironically, she didn't like the song. So they shelved her version, and then they finally got a cease and desist order not to release the song, because the Beatles had wisely decided that they were going to release it themselves. But imagine had Paul never released initially "Let It Be," and Aretha Franklin done it, and probably not done it with the greatest amount of enthusiasm, because according to Jerry Wexler, she just didn't like the song, and he thought she was crazy for not liking it. And she eventually did record it and did end up liking it, but initially she didn't care for it.
That's surprising, but
That is surprising.
she went on since Let It Be is so much a gospel type song,
Yeah,
gospel rock, and then she recorded Border Song, Elton John song,
yeah,
which was the biggest compliment to Elton John, who was new at the time, for someone of that stature to cover one of his songs. But you made a good point about some of these songs could have been Beatles songs, because you have bands like the Weaklings and Apple Jam, out of Seattle, and they've released their own versions, giving it a Beatles arrangement of some of these songs.
Hmm.
But how do you distinguish something like the Rolling Stones doing "I Want to Be Your Man"? Or even Billy J.Kramer doing "Do You Want to Know a Secret?" Because the Beatles recorded their own versions. They came out pretty close in time. Do you look at those as songs they gave away?
Yeah, they really were. They were initially intended, and either they were released just prior to or on the same day in some cases
Hmm.
as the Beatles version. But their intention, if there was a clear intention to give this song to a particular artist or to release it in advance of the Beatles version, then I do consider it a contribution.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
remember,
of
they did a lot of these songs too in when they recorded for the BBC. A lot of these songs that they ended up giving to other people, they did do as Beatles songs, but they, for whatever reason, decided not to properly record them and release them. But they did perform them on the radio for BBC, and they certainly performed some of them live.
mm,
So there was some intent to possibly release them as Beatles songs.
right. So much music to talk about here. Cilla Black also benefited, as you mentioned before. There's three songs that were Lennon McCartney songs given to her. Can't really see "It's for You" being done by the Beatles, although "Step Inside Love" they did
Yeah,
rehearse,
yeah,
as we know, and "Love of the Loved" they used to
yep,
do, and that was part of their Deck audition recording
right.
there. But how do you rate the Cilla Black material?
Um, I like personally. I always like "Step Inside Love." I think it was a great song.
Hmm.
"Love of the Loved." I think listening to that version on Deck Auditions kind of ruined it for me. I think Scylla's version was actually much better.
Hmm.
And "It's for You." I love Three Dog Night's version of that.
Very different. It's
Yeah, very different, but very good because it wasn't. Let's face it, it's a weak song, and I don't think Scylla knocked it out of the park. And I think Three Dog Night doing their unique arrangement of it was actually made the song much more approachable than Scylla's version. So
well, well, we can disagree on that one because I think Cilla Black. I think the arrangement that was given to "It's for You" had a real theatrical feel to it.
yeah, yeah, George
Yeah,
Martin, for sure had his imprint on that arrangement.
yeah. But if anyone has never heard the Three Dog Night version, it's almost entirely a cappella.
Yeah,
And then there's instrumentation towards the end, but a very unique way to present "It's for You."
yeah, and the phrasing on it was completely different.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
And
it's unique.
"Step Inside Love" really has like a jazz, almost Latin feel to it.
Yep.
So that I found really interesting.
Yep. Well, it's a great song too, but one of those things again that I think got lost in the shuffle because it was I think a TV theme, wasn't it, for a TV
Right.
show? Still
Yep.
still a TV show, yeah. So, and I know Paul worked with her extensively. There's recordings out there of him working with her in the studio to get the arrangement down right. And then in the final analysis, she went off and recorded it with another group of backing musicians. So Paul never actually contributed to the released version of that recording, but on the initial sessions, he played guitar on it.
Hmm. So from the Apple label and all the artists that recorded on Apple on, as far as songs given away, which ones would you consider to be the best?
My personal favorite, I love "On the Wings of a Nightingale" by the Everly Brothers. Paul couldn't have written a more tailor-made song for those guys who, talk about mutual admiration society.
Yeah.
I mean, the Beatles copied hook, line, and sinker everything, every phrase and note the Everly Brothers, every vocal harmony that Phil and Don did, John and Paul did. And they were huge fans of the Everlys. How could you not be? But, they'd kind of left the music scene for quite a period of time and then reunited and Paul went and saw them live. And needless to say, as I just mentioned, he was a huge fan of those guys. So he almost certainly, you know, Taylor wrote that song for them. And not only is it a great McCartney song, but it's a great Everly Brothers song and one of the last really great, what should have been a hit recording that they
Mm.
recorded at the tail end of their career.
Oh, I
It's a
agree with
great
you.
song.
I
Great song.
usually I usually list On the Wings of a Nightingale as probably the best song that Paul wrote for another artist. But then, come on, you got A World Without Love, which to me is a classic,
Yeah.
and Come and Get It, which everybody knows. So, any others that you'd single out as far as
Yeah. Well, I'm a huge Diana Krall fan. So,
hmm,
you know, when she recorded, Paul was going to do one of the songs he considered for his Kisses on the Bottom album was a song he wrote called If I Take You Home Tonight. And he never ended up doing it. And he should have, number one, for that album. And another song that he should have recorded his own version of for that album was Let's Love, which he gave to Peggy Lee. And I thought that song would have been ideal to for Paul to record and include on Kisses on the Bottom. But he went and did Baby's Request, which he'd already recorded years earlier on the Wings album Back to the Egg. But If I Take You Home Tonight is just a beautiful song, and
hmm,
Diana Krall knocked that one out of the park too. So
yeah.
beautiful song. So that's one of my favorites. And Sour Milk Sea, Jackie Womack's version of that song is far better than any version I've heard George do of that song.
Hmm.
And that song, of course, was considered for the Beatles' White Album. It was written in India in '68. Should have been on the White Album. It certainly would have was a better song than such as say Long, 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 or even Piggies. It's a far better rocker, just great song. And of course, it's bolstered by the fact that Eric Clapton lends his lead guitar work to Jackie's version of it. So, and also that song is unique in that not only did George write it and produce it and play on it, but Paul plays bass on it and Ringo plays drums on it.
Right.
So, with the exception of John Lennon not being present, it, for all intent and purposes, is a Beatles song with Jackie Womack doing the lead vocals.
That's
So
true.
yeah,
Yep.
and it would have
That's
fit right in on the White Album, like Hey Jude would have instead of Revolution Number 9. But that's another story.
yeah. Well, we can debate whether or not it should have been there over Piggies and Long, 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 because I love those two songs too. But
I do
if we
too.
if we had Sour Milk Sea all those years and we didn't have Piggies, you'd probably
Yeah,
be thinking that's the right decision to be made, I
yeah,
suppose.
or Not
But
Guilty. That's another one. There were a lot of good. Harrison was really coming into his own at that period in songwriting, and being a double album, he still only got his 2 songs per album. He got 4 songs on that album.
right,
But it's a pity that songs like Sour Milk Sea and Not Guilty didn't also make the White Album, because I mean, I would have taken those over, say, something like Wild Honey Pie or Why Don't We Do It in the Road, or some of the songs that I would consider a bit of throwaways, comparatively speaking, to the quality of those songs.
hmm.
But again, that's subjective. That's a matter of opinion.
Hey, you're not the only one that's voiced that opinion. In all the podcast shows that I've done and in other podcast shows, I've heard people say the same thing. Any others you want to point out?
Oh well, Fame is the other obvious one. Although John didn't really give much away, so to speak, other than to his wife Yoko, and he didn't really write the core of that song. He wrote a portion of it. It was
Hmm,
such a huge hit that it's and a timeless classic that it's you can't leave it out.
hmm.
I mean, it's certainly one of the few examples of where John went out and wrote a song with some other people and it became a huge hit. So that's always been one of my favorites. And of course, you mentioned Come and Get It, the Badfinger song, which certainly would have been well at home on Abbey Road right next to You Never Give Me Your Money.
Hmm.
And I've always suspected that that song was written as much about the woes at Apple and, the all you need is cash typewriters and TVs going out the back door or the front door.
Yeah.
But it was also, very apropos for the Magic Christian film, because
Hmm.
that was the theme of that film as well, which is one of my favorites.
And just like what you said about the Everly Brothers, I think that song was tailor-made for Badfinger, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
Paul told them, make sure you record it just like this.
Yes. And I suspect that it might have been a little too political for him to do within the confines of the Beatles at that point. They were in the process of breaking up. There was a lot of bitterness and fights over management at Apple, and for Paul to stick that on the album along with "You Never Give Me Your Money,"
Hmm.
give me your funny papers. I mean, there it is. How much more in your face can you be about the division between the McCartney Eastman camp and the Alan Klein
Hmm.
and the other three camp? And so I'm sure that all of the acrimony was set aside, and the harmony that George Martin requested for the sessions for Abbey Road was adhered to some degree, and probably the same reason that Cold Turkey didn't make it onto Abbey Road either. you
Right.
know, there were some political considerations there, I think.
Well, I'm just glad that those songs came out somehow,
Yes,
and
because they're great songs.
yeah, if it took solo careers, if it took writing for other artists, those were outlets for
Yep.
great material. Any others you want to mention?
Well, there are those sort of uncredited areas where that a Beatle really had a heavy hand in writing, in terms of just the production, the arrangement. And the one album that comes to mind, and Bob Purvis had told me this, he said, for all intent and purpose,
Mm.
Splinter's first album was really a George Harrison album, with us doing some of the song, most of the bulk of the songwriting and the singing. But he pretty much, inferred that George had a pretty heavy hand, and pretty good hand anyway, in helping to craft the arrangement of many of those songs. And of course, his brilliant acoustic guitar work throughout that album, and his obvious production hand in the production of that album. It's one of my favorite albums of all of the music that one or more of the Beatles went out and contributed to for other artists. That first Splinter album has to be one of my favorites.
Yeah. It's been said a number of times, and we'll do it again right now, but what the Splinter album, The Place I Love, was to George Harrison, McGear was to Paul McCartney.
Absolutely. Great,
So,
great analogy.
you listen to the Splinter album and it sounds just like a George Harrison album with different vocalists.
Yep.
And he even has George's friends all over the place, the Billy Prestons and Gary Wrights and
Yep.
Klaus Formans and people like
Yep.
that. And McGear is so much like a Wings album
Yeah. Yeah.
with
Yeah.
Mike McCartney doing the lead vocals.
And you
So
want to throw in another one of my favorites from that album is Rainbow Lady. Love that song.
mhm,
Leave It's great, but Rainbow Lady to me was the standout track, or The Man Who Found God on the Moon,
that's amazing.
or Giving Grease a Ride. I mean,
Yes.
just some good rockers on that. I mean, Jimmy McCullough's guitar work on there, that was his first real work with Wings, and it's no wonder that Paul, grabbed him for a lead guitarist, because the kid was wonderful on
Right.
guitar.
Listen to Giving Grease a Ride for Jimmy
Yep.
on there. And What Do We Really Know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Some great stuff on there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great album. So that's the fun part of it.
Okay. I want you
And
to have
another
your say on all the songs that you want to mention here.
Yeah, the other album that I really liked that gets looked passed over was the Radhakrishna Temple album
Hmm.
that George produced. Yes, it was religious music. Yes, it was the Hare Krishnas. And I think most people dismissed it out of hand, but Govinda and Hare Krishna Mantra, which were released as a single,
Hmm.
were two great recordings and two great songs, especially Govinda.
Yeah.
Very nice song that gets lost in the mix.
If you like that kind of stuff, a lot of that chant like music, obviously, I would hope you love My Sweet Lord or It Is He, Jai Shri Krishna. You
Yeah.
know, How can you not like Govinda?
Yeah, yeah,
A song like that, or the Hare Krishna mantra.
yeah,
So, and the arrangements are just so perfect for what was necessary.
yeah,
So it shows how much George learned as a producer and an arranger as well. So,
yeah, yeah.
hmm. All right. Any others you want to mention?
On the composition end,
Yeah.
well, those are the favorites. I mean, we could dive deeper into the sort of the projects where, like in my latest book, Chris Mullen, the people that Paul worked with at LIPA,
Mm,
helping them develop a song. The Natalie McCool song and the Chris Mullen song are both, even though McCartney isn't credited in helping write those,
right.
by the admission of both of those artists, he helped them considerably to craft those songs. So those are the ones that I like because Paul was humble enough, nice enough, and generous enough not to bother to take any credit for them, but took of his time and his talent to help these young aspiring artists learn how to write songs.
Right. And those three
Which,
people are mentioned in your book, the whole story with all three
yep,
of them. And we talked about those three in a previous show not that long ago. So if you want to learn more about it, pick up
pick up the
Chris's book.
book.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll mention some of mine. I won't go into detail on all of them because even though um, yeah, I can mention a lot more than these. But I at the top of my list, I had to put on the Wings of a Nightingale for the very same reason you mentioned. It's not just a great song, but it's so perfect for Phil and Don. I mean, it's just you can hear their harmonies. It's made just for them. 2.5 minutes, like a classic Everly Brothers song. And yeah, Dave Edmunds produced it too,
That's
with
correct. Forgot about that.
Paul playing acoustic guitar. You
Yep,
have to put A World Without Love in there because to me that is a classic. It was a #1 hit here in the
yep,
States. It's just a great song overall. And when you think about the whole history about A World Without Love, that it really was a an older song that Paul had written, but he didn't finish. He had to write the middle bit. And Peter Asher was aware of that song and he asked Paul to finish it off. And it took him like I think he said 15 minutes and he came back and he wrote the middle. Um, and the whole arrangement is fine. I love the arrangements of the Peter and Gordon singles. They're just right for the two of them. Yeah.
well, and then they also had George Martin and Abbey Road and Paul McCartney around to make sure that everything went according to plan. So
Hmm.
they certainly had a good support group around them.
Also, Woman, I think is, you know, it could be the best of those songs that Paul gave to Peter and Gordon. Really should have been a bigger hit, went top 20 here in the US. I had to put Badge in there from Cream.
Badge was on my list.
Yeah.
Definitely on my list. Um, yes, great song. Great song. I agree.
You kind of wish that George and Eric Clapton had written more together. Yes, they recorded a lot together, but they didn't write together. But the song's become a classic all these years on classic rock radio. Just absolutely love it. I had to put Bad to Me in there. Um, I like all the Billy J. Kramer stuff, and I'm glad you mentioned I'll Keep You Satisfied because I think that's very underrated.
Yeah,
Um, as is From a Window. I could
yeah,
probably hear the Beatles doing I'll Keep You Satisfied.
yeah. Well crafted
Yeah,
pop song.
and Bad to Me as well.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Those two were probably the two strongest.
I put Fame in there. I also put That Kind of Woman in there.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um, the thing that's interesting about that song is that there's two recordings of that song. One's by Gary Moore, the
Right,
other's by Eric Clapton.
right.
No disrespect to Eric Clapton, but the
Yeah, I
Gary
like the
Moore
more version
version,
better too. Yeah,
that rocks. And
yeah, I
George is
agree.
playing on it. It's a great bluesy rock song, kind of like Wreck of the Hesperus, in that
Hmm.
kind of vein, in a way. And the Eric Clapton version came out on the Nobody's Child compilation. Gary Moore's version came out on one of his albums. Really good rocker that George Harrison wrote. And I put It's For You from Cilla Black, Come and Get It, Goodbye from for Mary
I
Hopkin.
had Goodbye on the list too.
Yeah. Another perfect pop song. Sarah Milk Sea. I put Mine for Me on there for Rod Stewart. I think that's a pretty nice song. Um, Rod's very good, not just at the rockers, but with the ballads, and I think that song suited him. And I also put Let's Love in there too. It's a great thing whenever any of the Beatles can work with one of their heroes, like George Harrison working with Roy Orbison, for example, something
Yeah,
like that. And it's the same thing, Paul working with Peggy Lee.
or the Everleys.
Um, and I only included one more song, and it's the theme from the Honorary Consul.
Oh yeah, the great acoustic guitar work there, the John
It,
Williams thing. Yeah,
it's really very pretty. And
yeah,
then if you like Love in the Open Air, the Family Way theme, you'd like that as well. And all this stuff is on YouTube if you want to check it out. But it's a very pretty song. It was for the movie, The Honorary Consul, which was retitled here in the States Beyond the Limit, I think.
yes, that's correct.
And just a very beautiful song. There's a lot of stuff that's out there that just came out as singles or maybe was an album cut that unless you were aware of it at the time, unless you subscribe to a Beatle fan or a Beatles monthly, you wouldn't have known about a lot of this stuff. But now, thankfully, again, it's in this book, Beatles Fully Uncovered.
There's another one you've reminded me of it's kind of obscure and not easy to find, but it was only recently released posthumously, of course, in George's case. But the Gary Wright song "To Discover Yourself"
Mm.
that he wrote with George, I think is a beautiful song.
And wasn't that just Gary on piano and nothing else?
Yeah, there were two versions of it, I believe. One with Gary on piano, and then I think he did another one later with Ringo on drums, or I might have that confused with a different song. But that's a really nice song. And then another one that I think gets overlooked is New Moon Over Jamaica
Oh yeah,
with Johnny Cash
right.
and Paul. So
And Tom T. Hall.
yes,
Yeah.
which was written in part down in Jamaica at Johnny Cash's home down there. So I thought that was
Interesting thing about that song is if you remember the radio series Ubu Jubu, where they played a lot of what was then unreleased McCartney stuff. There was a version of New Moon Over Jamaica, but it was a reggae version of
right,
the song. So it was a completely different arrangement than the one
right,
that Johnny Cash put out on his album.
right.
And yeah, Paul does sing a bit of lead vocal on the song, as does Tom T. Hall. And they sound great together.
Yeah.
But yeah, another person that Paul admired so much, Johnny Cash.
And one of the things I point out to people about my book that I think shows the breadth and versatility and broad range of musical appreciation that the Beatles had is when you look at the artists in my book and you see everything from Ravi Shankar, which is world Indian music, and you see Johnny Cash, and now we're going to have Dolly Parton in that camp.
Yeah.
Johnny Cash, who's a country legend, and then you have Bob Dylan with George Harrison. Then you have Cheech and Chong, which was a comedy act, essentially with George Harrison. And you pan that scope of music that they were into and contributed to. It's remarkable. It's absolutely and Paul with classical music.
Yep.
I mean, there's the other than maybe jazz. I can't think of any other musical genre that the Beatles haven't dabbled in at one point or another.
Right. And then you've got David Peel.
there
You've
was
got
there was a song there under production that was on that album that only John Lennon could have produced. Okay, which is an F is not a dirty word
uh-huh.
song. Who else but John Lennon would have said, "Yeah, let's produce that. Do that
And
one, David."
and actually, since you mentioned Dolly Parton, it's not the first time Paul has recorded with Dolly Parton because Cat Stevens
Oh, that's
released a
right.
song that was a bonus track on one of his CDs,
Right.
Boots and Sand,
Sand. Yes.
and Paul sings on it and Dolly sings on it.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. Good
Yeah.
call.
Well, I need this book to keep reminding me of
Yeah.
everything.
And unfortunately, I shouldn't say this, but it's already outdated by about 3 or 4 songs or recordings that have been released. That uh, Alan Darby album, Rolling Man, that Ringo plays on, and
Mhm.
it's a great song that Ringo plays on. And then the Exploring Birds song,
Right.
again, another one of those where Paul Lipa connection, called Ever the Optimist, which is a great song. I really like that song.
Yeah. I was telling you about that. The thing is,
Yeah,
you play it, and it's not like Paul leaps at you there, like you know that he had anything to do with it.
yeah,
You never know if you weren't told.
no, but it
So,
grows on you.
yeah,
I mean, it's an infectious song. It's hard to get it out of your head once you start to listen to it.
right. Okay. So those are my choices for songs that they wrote for other people or co-wrote. So why don't we do as musicians for other artists, and tell us some of your picks.
Well, that's the area where, to me, George Harrison really shines. And for anyone that's familiar with the songs that George contributed his solo slide guitar work to for other artists, I think it's fair to say that his best work wasn't on his own albums, it was for other people, which speaks volumes about him and maybe his wanting to prove himself. But my favorite at the top of that list has to be, and apparently it was also George Harrison's all-time favorite guitar solo for anyone, including himself, was "Leave a Light On" by Belinda Carlisle. And while some Beatle fans might turn up their nose at a former and member of and still member of the Go-Go's, uh, it's a great song. It's a great production. Rick Knowles did a great job in the production, and George Harrison plays a searing slide solo on it that literally took the song from a hit to an international mega #1 hit. His slide guitar work on that song elevates that song to a whole nother level. And even if you don't like Belinda Carlisle and you don't like that song or her voice, you cannot fall in love or greatly admire that guitar solo that George Harrison does on that song. It's
Hmm.
just unbelievable, unbelievable. And runner up to that one is a song by a relatively unknown British artist by the name of Sylvia Griffin called Love's a State of Mind. And there's an interesting story in my book about how that collaboration came about. It came about through Elton John and Rocket Records, who she recorded for. And she has a great story to tell about George and how wonderful he was to lay down his slide guitar on that song. But that's another searing Harrison slide solo on that song, and
Mhm.
it's an obscure song, hard to find. It's on a British CD single, so unless you're searching around on the internet, you're not going to be able to find a physical copy of that single too easily. It is out there, but it's one of the tougher ones to find.
Mm.
And then I love "Lift Me Up" from Jeff Lynne's album Armchair Theater. It's got a great George played on a number of songs in that album, and plays a great guitar bit on "Lift Me Up."
Sure.
And then Roy Orbison's "Love So Beautiful" for George's acoustic guitar on that. Just the way he strums his guitar along with the piano on that song, to me, just works so well. It's understated, but overwhelming in a way, because it really gives the song all of its sort of soul and feel. So that's one of my favorites.
Hmm.
And then "Day After Day," although a lot of people don't know that that's both Pete Ham and George
Right.
do a duet slide uh, guitar solo on that song. But classic song, classic rock song, great slide guitar solo by George and Pete Ham, and that certainly rounds out my top five for the instrumentation. And not ironically, they're all George Harrison songs. So speaks volumes about just how underrated, even within the Beatles, I think he was as a guitar player. So
Hmm. Yeah, I was wondering if we should have done a separate category of the solo Beatles working together for each other. You know,
Yeah,
you're talking about George's slide guitar work. How can you not include How Do You Sleep?
yeah. Or uh, um, It Don't Come Easy, or
Hmm,
Photograph, or But if you get into that, that's a whole nother book.
right.
That really is a whole nother book.
Yeah, it's really a different category there.
Yeah,
But they did so much work helping
with
each
each
other
other.
out,
Yeah,
you know, just
yeah,
listening to Beautiful Night the other day, and Ringo is just the right touch on the drums
yep.
for Paul, and you can hear his vocals at the end singing along. Um, yeah, it's a lot of stuff there. You want to mention any others before I mention mine?
Nope, go ahead.
Okay. I don't want to take up most of the time here, but I
No,
don't know
it's
how.
your show, man.
Yeah, but you're my guest.
You go
Uh,
for it.
I don't know how anyone could put together a list like this without including My Dark Hour. I mean, my God, the drumming from Paul on there is
Yep,
just absolutely outstanding. And
yep.
every now and then you'll get a conversation going about how good was Paul as a drummer. And I would never say he's better than Ringo, but he has such a great feel. And I wish he did more drumming. I find a lot of his stuff that he does, even Creator Crory, it's very,
Yeah.
it's
Oh yeah.
very, it's
Yeah.
very different and innovative in its own way. And he knows how to do great fills. He has a great feel to his drumming. And you know, you tell people if they never heard My Dark Hour, that's Paul McCartney on drums, they'd be shocked, I think.
Yeah, and there's such a great story behind that song as well.
Yeah.
The whole evolution and origin of that song, and it's bittersweet when the title of the song really kind of sums up exactly what the backstory is to that song, which
Mm,
very much has to do with kind of the day the Beatles really broke up, and that's by Paul's telling, not anyone else's. That's not my opinion or your opinion. That's
right.
the opinion of Paul McCartney. So that song did come out of a very, very dark hour in
Hmm.
his life.
And it just whatever he played was out of his frustration,
Yeah, yeah.
or angst or whatever you want to
which,
call it.
which is
But
probably why the drumming is so ferocious.
yeah,
There's probably a bit of anger release there.
but I wish that I'd hear Paul drum more. That moment on Unplugged where he
Hmm.
gets behind the kit,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, and he did a
with
lot of the drumming on his solo albums, and
yeah,
and so you know.
I know. I love his drumming. Um, there's a few duets that I had to include in here. Um, I love Heal the Pain, which is George Michael with Paul McCartney.
Hmm.
One of the great things, and this also makes me appreciate the Beatles more and more as vocalists, is how well they blend with other people. I mean, the Traveling Wilburys are the perfect
Oh
example
yeah,
of
yeah.
five vocalists that couldn't be more different from each other, and yet
Right.
they work well together. And George blends so well with all these other people. And Paul McCartney, whether he's singing with Stevie Wonder or Michael Jackson or Johnny Cash and Tom T. Hall,
Yeah.
he just blends. It just works. Somehow it's just the right mix. The voice suits the song perfectly. And he sounded great with George Michael. The frustrating thing for me with all these duets is I wish he did more of them.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of
Yeah.
people
George.
frown on the Michael Jackson collaboration,
Oh,
but
not
they
me.
sounded fantastic together.
Yeah, that's a great production. Steve
Yeah,
Lukather playing guitar on that song as well. So there you go. That's how far back he goes with the Beatles.
yeah. You mentioned Jeff Lynne with Lift Me Up, which is one of mine, but he's done a lot of great stuff for Jeff outside of Cloud Nine and the Traveling Wilburys. On that same album, Armchair Theater, Stormy Weather.
Oh yeah.
Oh, great slide guitar work from George there. And on the ELO album, Zoom, there's a song called A Long Time Gone, which must have been one of the last recordings that George made. It's a beautiful song, and he adds just the right touch on the slide there. I put Leave a Light On, Belinda Carlisle. Most recently, the Umoza project. the
Yes,
tone.
yes,
That
I
was
like it.
fantastic.
Yes, I agree.
Paul adding bass to that. This was all done during COVID, and yeah, an incredible recording. All this stuff you should listen to on YouTube if you haven't heard it. The charity single of Ferry Across the Mersey for the Hillsborough disaster. Paul's vocals are fantastic on it. You know, one of the things that I like about Ferry Across the Mersey, that version, is that so many of these charity singles have so many superstars on the record, and each one of them sings a line, and that's it. But Paul actually sings quite a bit of Ferry Across the Mersey. So it's a very special recording in that regard. Um, I put Govinda in there as well. You talk about George's Slide. How about Carl Perkins? Distance makes no difference with love.
Oh yeah, that was on my list as well.
Yeah.
Yep, that was on my list as well. Especially the one version that never got released. That's out on bootlegs. I really like that one version.
Of that song?
Yeah.
Oh, I
No, not
never.
distance makes no difference. My old friend. No, not my old. It wasn't my old friend. Yeah, my old friend.
My old friend was on the same album.
Yeah, but there's an alternate version of that with Paul
Uh-huh.
that was never released. It's on a bootleg.
Okay. All right. That's the
Yeah,
one where it's taken from the video of the two of them?
I
You're
know
not
it's
sure?
another version from that as well. I think. I think it's different. I'd have to double check, but there are
Okay.
several versions of that that are out there, and there's one in particular that I think is better than the ones that are well, at least more available.
Hmm.
I also should correct one thing I said earlier. I didn't mean to infer that George Martin produced the Peter and Gordon songs. He didn't. John Burgess did, but who was their producer. But they certainly had a good support group around him. No, there's another version of My Old Friend um, I don't believe was released officially. And I
Okay.
think there are actually three different. You can check in my book, but I think there's actually two or three different versions of that song, and I think one of them never got officially released. I could be mistaken, but
Okay.
it's going from memory.
I tell you, we heard about that song for a
Long
long time
time
before it came
before we
out.
got to hear it. Yeah,
Yeah. It was mentioned in Club Sandwich and
yeah,
Beatles Monthly, and it's like, when is it coming out? And then Carl Perkins released an album called Go Cat Go. That's
right.
on there. The song with George Harrison, Distance Makes No Difference
A
with Love.
difference.
There's a version of Blue Suede Shoes from
Yep,
John, taken from Live Peace in
from
Toronto.
yep, and then
And
a
there's
Ringo one.
with Honey Don't,
Yeah,
where they mix Carl's vocals with Ringo's live with the All
right,
Stars. So
right.
all four Beatles are on that album.
Well,
Really good album too.
yeah, it is.
For
It is a very good album.
got a lot
And
of
what I
great people
have
on
to
there.
say too, while you're mentioning Carl Perkins, I had the good pleasure of meeting him on a number of occasions, as well as his boys, and interviewing one of his sons extensively. A nicer human being in the music business or any business you could ever meet than Carl Perkins. An absolute humble, generous gentleman, country gentleman is the
Hmm.
word that comes to mind when I think of Carl Perkins. A nicer guy you could ever meet. He was just absolutely invited me down for breakfast in the morning at the hotel, and
Uh-huh.
we must have sat around at the table with him and his boys for several hours drinking coffee, and just like we were old friends and had known each other for years. Wonderful guy. We greatly missed.
I couldn't have said it better. I've interviewed him a couple times, and he has to rate, you know, one of the nicest people ever
Yeah,
on the planet. If you wanted to interview him and all you knew was Blue Suede Shoes, he'd treat you like you're gold. It wouldn't
yeah.
even matter to him. He would treat you like it was an honor for him to be with you. You know?
Exactly. That's the way he treated me. Yeah, he treated me like royalty, like I was his special guest.
Right.
What can you say about a guy like that? And he was great live. Got to see him live a number of times, and he'd lost nothing, man. He could still play and entertain and sing, and yeah,
Yeah. Well, you can just tell when you watch that special,
yeah,
the
with
Carl Perkins
Clapton and
special,
yeah,
how much George looked up to him.
yeah,
George was his student.
yeah.
You know, Eric Clapton looked up to him, Dave Edmonds, all these great people.
Roseanne Cash, all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, she probably knew him since she was a kid
Yeah.
because he toured with her dad and he
Right.
backed up Johnny. So for
Uh-huh.
years. Yeah,
That's such an enjoyable special. One of the highlights.
it is. I agree.
And seeing George Harrison come to life. So happy.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great special.
Yeah. A few more I just want to mention. Just to get Ringo in there. Um, there's a few duets. Band of Steel
Oh
with
yeah, yeah,
with a
yeah. The
country
Guthrie
artist.
Thomas thing, I
Yeah,
think.
and
Yeah,
country artist, the two of them singing together for
yeah,
people who love when Ringo does country, which once in a while, I know he did Buku's of Blues, but he'll sprinkle in a country song here and there on his albums. They sounded great together, and it's a bit of a novelty, but Little Grass Shack,
yeah. The Leon Redbone.
right, with Ringo. And
Yeah,
that's on Leon's album Whistling in the Wind, and that's something you should check out. There's a lot of these duets that a lot of fans don't even know about.
yeah,
Um, and I put Walking on Thin Ice. And actually,
yeah,
a lot of John's productions with Yoko would have to be mentioned here. But John's guitar playing on Walking on Thin Ice,
yeah,
those stinging notes there really drive the
yeah.
song and make the song. Um, yeah, and one more we mentioned Carl Perkins. How about Dwayne Eddy?
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah. I had him on the list too, both for the McCartney and the Harrison
right,
uh, contributions to that album.
right. Yeah, he did a cover with Paul there of Rockestra theme.
Right.
But there's an instrumental called Theme for Something Really Important that I really
Hmm.
like a lot, which has George's slide work on it,
Yep.
which is definitely something worth checking out.
You mentioned Ringo and country. I'd long had the idea, and I'd suggested it to a number of his people over the years, that Ringo might want to consider. It's getting a little late in the day now, but he should have considered doing a country all-star band.
I've been saying the same thing. You're not alone. I'm surprised he hasn't done that.
Yeah, I think it
And
would work.
would he just do the classic country stars?
Well, I
Because
think like I say, it's getting a little long in the day for that for his
right.
contemporaries. But had he have considered that maybe 20 years ago, I think they could have put something together with Willie Nelson and
Yep.
with a whole host of people, kind of like the Farm Aid thing that he sat in on,
Uh-huh.
and he could have still done his hits, and but then all these country artists could have done their hits that he could have drummed to, and I think he would have drawn in a huge alternate crowd that he normally wouldn't have drawn in, and I think he would have been incredibly well received.
I totally agree with you. You know, I interviewed Ken Mansfield, God bless him, who passed away recently. Um, but he told me that one of his jobs, working with the Beatles, was to make sure that Ringo would get the albums from the United States that he wanted and have them shipped out to him in England. And he loved the country music of the 70s. He loved all the outlaw stuff. He loved Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, got to record with Willie Nelson. Um, but I did ask him, did the country community know that much about Buku's of Blues when it came out? And he said, oh, yeah, a lot of people in the country field enjoyed it. So people in that field, I'm sure they embraced Ringo a bit, and got to realize even though the Beatles did country music and rockabilly music anyway, to start off your career with standards and then country music and albums uh took some guts there, I think.
Yeah, and I think him doing Act Naturally,
Yeah,
very early on established him as kind of a country music fan. So I think the country music community probably said, "Oh man, there's a guy in the Beatles that actually likes country music."
yeah,
But and while we're mentioning country music, the "You're Only Happy When You're Miserable" on Rodney Crowell's
yeah,
album that Ringo drums on is another song that I considered for one of Ringo's better drumming outings, and I love that song, and I love Rodney Crowell, and so does Ringo. So there again is another example of someone who would have probably fit in really well in a country all-star band.
right. I totally agree with you. Want to mention just a few more things as far as production? You want to highlight
Yeah,
just a
well,
couple?
I mean, it kind of covers bases, production and instrumentation. But the obvious one is "Those Were the Days," Mary Hopkins,
Mm,
which Paul had pushed her and many other people to record. And I think Mary was reluctant in recording a lot of the songs on the Postcard album that Paul produced, because Paul's vision of that album was show tunes and standards, and I think Mary's vision of that album was Welsh folk songs.
mm,
And Those Were the Days, obviously, it was a huge international hit. The McCartney's production on it and his playing on it are perfect.
hmm.
So that has to be high on the list of one of their best produced songs. Try Some Buy Some, even though Phil and George had Phil Spector helping him produce it, the legendary Phil Spector, or infamous Phil Spector. Try Some Buy Some could have been a big hit. I don't know why it wasn't for Ronnie Spector. I don't think it was promoted properly. It's a great song. It's a little bit depressing in terms of its lyrics, but I love Ronnie's version of that song. I love
Mm,
the production on it. That's the Way God Planned It, which George produced for Billy Preston, is just an amazing song and an amazing
right.
track. And I love a lot that whole Shankar Family and Friends album that George produced and played on and had a major hand in, who toured with him in '74. I Am Missing You. That song is just a wonderful song, and I love that album. Everything, that's just a great album to put on and listen to, the Shankar Family and Friends album. So that like the Splinter album ranks as one of my favorites from that period.
Yeah, well, your list is pretty similar to mine. That's fine though, but yeah, you have to look at the Postcard album from Mary Hopkin. Yeah, Paul's vision of what he wanted Mary to be was not what Mary wanted.
Right.
She was more at home with the Donovan
Yeah,
songs,
yeah. Welsh
you
folk
know.
songs.
Yeah, and that was certainly evident in her follow-up album, Earth
Hmm.
Song. I mean, yeah, Earth Song, Ocean Song.
Yeah.
She's nailing it. Her voice is so perfect
Yeah.
for that kind of music. Very much like Judy Collins to me.
Yes, I agree. That's a great comparison.
Yeah.
Very, very accurate comparison.
But
Agree.
those were the days as a marvelous production. You have to give credit to Richard Hewson
Oh
for the
yeah,
arrangement.
that's right.
He's the one who
Forgot
put
about him.
together all the instrumentation for that song, but still the production on it is just fantastic. Um, every now and then you'd hear somebody, at least I have on the radio, make the mistake of saying that Paul wrote Those Were the Days.
No.
But no, he produced it, but still an amazing production. Everything on Postcard. And I actually, I know Mary didn't want to do the Broadway stuff. There's no business like show business
Right, right.
and George, but I love the whole production and the arrangements of all the songs on there.
Oh, it's a good album. No
Yeah,
question. It's a good album, but it's more Paul's baby than hers.
yeah, that's true. The Splinter album, like we mentioned, The Place I Love, the McGear album, you have to bring up. I'm the Urban Spaceman. I love the production on that by the Bonzo Dog Band. Became a top 10 hit in the UK.
Yeah,
Yeah. The stuff that John and Yoko produced together for Yoko's albums, Approximately Infinite Universe, I would put in
yeah,
there.
and Fly too. I think Fly was also a really, really good album.
Mm, well,
And the stuff on Milk and Honey and Double Fantasy. I mean, those productions, of course, they had Jack Douglas there, but
right.
still good.
Oh, I love Jack Douglas's production on well, Double Fantasy, not with Milk and Honey. He wasn't
Yeah,
involved with Milk and Honey. But yeah. And then I love it when it's stripped down too. It's the quality of the songs too that matter more to me than the production.
right.
Um, yeah, and gotta mention Pussycats.
Yes, we
Is
forgot that one, and that was on my list too. One of my favorite productions, Many Rivers to Cross. I just think that's such a great for John to produce that the way he produced that song is
yeah,
remarkable.
definitely. And of course he used the the string section from that as a background for Number 9 Dream.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, the George Harrison stuff, immediately Jackie Lomax's album comes to mind. Is This What You Want? The Billy Preston albums, definitely
Doris
Doris
Troy.
Troy, all very well produced,
Yeah.
So I think about those when it comes to George. And those would be the ones I would single out the most when it comes to production. But I don't know,
I
for
would
me
agree.
personally, the songwriting aspect and the musician aspect is more interesting for me.
Well, yeah,
But
yeah, and for me too. I mean, productions, unless you read the liner notes and the credits, you probably there's no way you're going to be able to say like you would with Phil Spector or other producers, where you would just listen to it and say, "Oh yeah, that's Paul McCartney production," or "Oh yeah, that's a George Harrison production." But nonetheless, when you know that they did produce it, and you listen to some of these great hits like "Those Were the Days,"
mm,
or then you realize, yeah, these guys know how to produce as well.
day after day,
Yeah.
yeah. All right. This has been fantastic. You wanted to pass along a message to our viewers?
Yeah, I'm hoping that people that haven't gotten my book will get my book, and the best way to get it, I have a very simple email to remember. You can get it on Amazon or Barnes and Nobles or any of the book retailers online or in brick and mortar. But my email is for any Beatle fan, is very easy to remember: 6270 at charter.net. So if you remember that the Beatles were together with EMI from 62 to 70, and we had those greatest hits albums, the red and the blue albums, 62 and to through 70. That's all you need to remember are those four numbers at charter.net, and you'll find me and you'll find my book, and you'll be able to get signed copies, and I'll get them out to you right away. So if you're interested, email me.
All right. And
6270 at charter.net. Go ahead,
and
say.
we'll
Yeah,
keep it in the description box,
great.
for anyone that wants to order your book. And by all means, if there are any songs here that we mentioned that you're not
Oh
familiar
yeah.
with, just go to YouTube because it's all on there. I'll try to provide links to many of them that we discussed here.
Not only that, but if anybody that does have my books or gets my books discovers something that they're absolutely certain that I missed and left out, please get a hold of me, because if there's another updated version, we'd love to include it. But at the very least, I like to let all the fans and collectors of these recordings, like Ken and myself, know that there are more out there that we don't know about or we just discovered. So if you know of some, even if it hasn't been released, if you know of some recording that one of the Beatles contributed to that is not in the book, please get a hold of me and let me know.
We always want Kris here to update his book.
I
So
know.
keep him working, This
Yeah.
this this fortunately is a part of the Beatles history that doesn't end. And as I've mentioned many times on my podcast shows, especially, Ringo always drums for somebody on their album, usually one track. He keeps doing that, especially with the members of the All Stars, like
Yeah.
Colin Hay or Steve Lukather. Yeah. And Paul, you never know when he's
Who,
contributing for someone else.
yeah. When he's going to show up and, or passes a studio door and hears something that catches his ear, and he goes in and ends up playing drums and piano and bass and things, backing vocals, and lends a hand in production. That's just who he is.
Yeah, whatever he wants to do. And thankfully, we have books, the books that Kris has put out to keep us up to date on all this stuff. So again, thank you, Kris, for joining us. We'll have you back again.
My
And
pleasure, Ken.
thanks to all of you for watching. Thanks to all my subscribers. And we'll see you next time.
Great job as usual. Thank you.
Thank you, Kris.